the last Disciplines 101 for this semester. This is the activity of Seacoast, the Coastal Adaptation over Space and Time Collaboratory. And in this activity, researchers from a bunch of different disciplines take turns teaching each other about the basics of our disciplines in the context of coastal processes and coastal issues, so that we can learn the different methods and perspectives and sorts of analyses that other people studying some of the same or overlapping topics and processes that we study hopefully lead to some new kinds of science and collaborations. So we're going to continue this next semester, and next semester we will start seeding in more of these discussions to synthesize the various lessons that we've had. And we're going to start with our first one today. In the second half of this session, Marty Smith will facilitate a discussion. We've provided some questions to potentially seed the discussion, but we'll follow discussion where it goes to synthesize some of our select previous topics. Before that, we get to have a lesson from Kathy Dello, and this is a great pleasure. Kathy has degrees in meteorology and geography and environmental science, and she is a science communicator. Very cool job title. And she's director of the State Climate Office for North Carolina. So I feel really fortunate to get to learn from Kathy for the next while. And so this will be something like 20-minute presentation and then 10 or 15 minutes of discussion on these particular topics, and we can segue into the more open-ended discussion from there. There'll be for the question and answer for this lesson in particular, Catherine Anarde will facilitate that. So send questions either to everyone, and Catherine will ask you to ask your question when the time comes, or if you'd prefer, just send it to Catherine and she can ask it for you. So with that, take it away, Kathy.
Great, thank you so much, Brad. Thank you for that introduction. Are my slides up?
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you all for coming out today. I'm sorry I had to postpone my last talk. Thank you to the gift of science. I got my Pfizer vaccine and also got a fever with it, but I'll totally take it. So really happy to be here today, especially because it's Earth Day. This is a big day for people in our field, but also the Climate Summit has kicked off in DC. And I'm feeling a lightness and a buoyancy in kind of my collaborators and colleagues that hasn't been felt in a long time. This is something we've been talking about, the climate crisis, and now we're going to take steps to change it and fix it. So I altered my talk a little bit. Normally I'd just be giving you the basic North Carolina Climate Change 101, but I'm sure you've already heard a lot of that over these past few weeks. And I also just kind of wanted to talk about resilience, and the climatology challenge is part of the title that I was supposed to use, not this one, and looking at what North Carolina might be able to do in the next few years. So briefly, just if you haven't heard about the State Climate Office, we're a public service center chartered by the UNC system, and I'm in the College of Sciences at NC State. And we're one of the most active in the country. We're the biggest east of the Mississippi. This is in terms of dollars and people. And this was because of some really forward thinking by past directors, setting up a monitoring network around the state, kind of before we were even really thinking about the big impacts of anthropogenic climate change. And then, as we all know, the impacts of climate change are big and here in our backyards in North Carolina. So there's a lot of need for an office like mine, which is kind of the climate data and knowledge center for the state. And I don't wake up in the morning and decide what we're going to do. We are evolving to the needs of policymakers and decision makers. So it's really the end user who drives our agenda. They come to us with requests for tools or research or outreach events or education, and that's how we do what we do. So the State Climate Office of 10 years ago is not the same State Climate Office today, and the State Climate Office 10 years from now won't be the same State Climate Office today. It really evolved from a place of truly a man with a filing cabinet and, sorry, it's active downtown today, writing temperature observations, to where we are now, which is what I call big-ish data. We've got all sorts of climate and environmental data on our hands, and I want you all to use it, so please reach out. And we have really strong connections with other federal regional climate centers. So NKICS is up in Asheville. There's the CCASC at NC State. A number of you folks on the call we have connections with, and if we haven't met, please reach out. I would love to have a Zoom coffee with you. But now to the meat of my talk. This was a perfect article that showed up in the New York Times a couple Sundays ago. And it really describes the challenge we have on our hands in North Carolina. It gets to the problem, the science, the decisions that have to be made, and truly one tiny town, Avon, North Carolina. And there are so many Avons around the state, around the country, and around the world. And people are now facing the facts. What are we willing to pay to save our town? What are we willing to pay to save our livelihoods? Who should pay and what should they pay? So many of you know that Nags Head has been replenishing their beaches, and they say that's cheaper than the alternative. So homeowners in Avon were deciding if they wanted to increase their taxes to help deal with the climate change problem. And I like to highlight this. I do a lot of guest lectures for classes. I mean, this truly touches on all the pieces of resilience. Resilience isn't just science, it's a piece of it, but there are people involved. There are cultures and lived experiences and generations of folks who have grown up in Avon, and also a tourism economy, which North Carolina wants to continue. Climate change is here and now. We don't get the luxury of talking about this like a future thing, like I did at the beginning of my career. We've had 7 of our top 10 warmest years since 2007 in North Carolina. The last 6 years have had the warmest overnight temperatures on record, and extremely so. If we were to look at the graph of this, they just pop right out. And this is something we're seeing across the planet and in the US. And one of the reasons is that just we're more sensitive to a temperature change at nighttime. The column of air that needs to heat up is essentially smaller, so it's easier to do that. And this has huge public health implications, especially in low-income communities where people don't have access to sufficient cooling, or with farm workers that work outside all day and are already stressed, and they come home and they can't recover. It also has agricultural implications. So some of the things that grow well in North Carolina grow well here because we normally have cooler nighttime temperatures and cooler winters. 2018 was our wettest year on record. That was Hurricane Florence. We certainly saw that flooding across our entire landscape, but 2020 was the second wettest on record. And we'll talk a little bit about this. There wasn't a Hurricane Florence last year, but for all of us who lived in North Carolina, our lived experiences point to it being a very wet year. And some of this is happening because of no-name flooding. So it's not always a hurricane that gets us. But we're seeing an increase in fires, sea level rise. Obviously, a number of folks on this call can talk about this more than I can. Hurricanes are becoming more intense, and seeing more flash droughts. And we're kind of in a flash drought right now. We had an extremely wet February and March, and April's dried out pretty much. And we're starting to worry about some of our water supplies and some of our crops going into the next few weeks. But I just want to highlight our low-income and minority communities are the most at risk in a changing climate in North Carolina. So I wanted to just pull out some 2020 facts. These are always interesting to look back on. 2020 really had everything, not just a pandemic, but we had every type of weather that you could possibly imagine, and some pretty severe weather in North Carolina. So we had the 6th most tornadoes since 1950. And for whatever reason, the bullseye was on North Carolina. Tornado Alley was not in Oklahoma. It was not Virginia either. They stayed within our borders. But we saw a bunch of those come from tropical systems. So we only had one direct hit by a hurricane last year, Isaias, but we had remnants of 10 tropical systems come at us. So it'll either hit us directly or come at us from the Gulf as remnants or a tropical storm. So we kind of get it from both sides here in North Carolina. We saw flooding across the entire state during so many months of the year. I can almost pick out any single month and show you significant flooding. But a number of our rivers saw top 10 highest crests during events that were not hurricanes. So February 7th, early in 2020, we saw some in May. These are those no-name events that I'm talking about. They don't get a name on the Weather Channel. They don't get a lot of press, but they're increasing. So you dump 3 or 4 inches of rain quickly on a river or a stream or downtown Raleigh, and you see the impacts pretty quickly. And just looking again at some of these no-name events, an upper level low on May 20th, this was some of the worst flooding we saw across the state last year. And then we finally saw a tropical system show up. And I say finally because this is before the start of the hurricane season, but Tropical Storm Bertha also then dumped a bunch of rain on us in May. And I remember that being a very interesting time because we were 2 months into the pandemic. And one of the things that we started talking about in our office, we kept getting calls and people are like, is it rainier than normal? Is it windier than normal? Or am I just home? So we answered a lot of those questions for people. Turns out it was rainier than normal, but not windier than normal. And then when we look at November, this was an extremely catastrophic event. Rocky Mount got 12 inches of rain in just a number of hours. There were fatalities associated with this Eta-related event. So it wasn't a tropical storm at this point, but the remnants hit North Carolina. So we had a mixed bag. It was hot, it was severe. We had a tiny bit of snow, not much. That's a climate change thing, and lots of rain. So the director of emergency management reached out to us and said, can you tell me a little bit more about how storms are changing? Is it getting wetter? So Corey Davis in my office did this quick analysis, which was really great, looking at long-term stations in North Carolina, looking at the average 95th percentile by a 30-year chunk. So we call those climate normals, and seeing how they've changed by season. And we've seen an increase, the latest 30-year chunk, in summer and fall. We're also seeing more of our events shifting away from really light events toward kind of the mid to medium high range of events. It's not always going to be a 7-inch storm or a 12-inch storm like Rocky Mount, but we're seeing fewer of those 1/10 of an inch, 20th of an inch storms and turning those more into 1 or 2 inches. So when we think about resilience in North Carolina, I really like this definition that was used in the 2020 Risk and Resilience Plan by the North Carolina state agencies. It's a state where our communities, economies, and ecosystems are just better able to rebound and thrive and adapt to climate change. I like that this speaks to a quality of life, healthy growth, durable systems. One of the things we learned in the pandemic is you cannot shut down an entire economy and still fix climate change. So that's off the table for anyone who was concerned that we were going to do that. But we have to support the economy and just us thriving as North Carolinians to be truly resilient. And we're hearing all sorts of solutions being thrown out now, especially with an infrastructure plan finally out. But resilience is so many things. Resilience is broadband access. Resilience is access to parks and grocery stores, and just what I like to think of as a better community. So just roughly breaking down our options, we have them and we can make them. We can adapt to climate change or we cannot adapt. This is very basic. I'm not going to get into all the policy nuances in 20 minutes. Or we can reduce our fossil fuel use, or we can not reduce our fossil fuels. If we reduce our fossil fuel use and adapt to climate change, we thrive as a state. We win. This is exactly where we want to be, up here in this corner. If we don't reduce and The we is the entire planet, which hopefully we're meeting today and getting some things out of that. Biden's plan is very aggressive, but if we don't reduce and we don't adapt, we suffer. And that is especially those low-income minority communities, but really everybody. It's going to be hard to outrun climate change if this is the path that we choose. But we're time limited up here. The analogy I like to use is if you fall asleep on the bus, you don't wait till the very last stop to get off the bus when you wake up. You wake up and you say, oh no, I missed my stop, gotta get off. We have fallen asleep on the bus as a planet, and we need to wake up and get off as soon as we can. There are still a few more stops for us, but there's going to be a point where we can't adapt or build resilience out of climate change because it'll be so bad. And one of the things I thought early on in my career was, well, we would never let that happen. And like I said, today feels lighter and more buoyant than it has in a very long time. So hopefully, we won't get to that point where we've run out of time, the clock has run out, and we're destined to suffer. And then I start to think about some of the emerging hazards in North Carolina, fire being one of them. So I came from the West Coast, and this was certainly on the front of my mind there. And when I got here, I started thinking about the 2016 Gatlinburg fire, which is this is a picture of that event and the number of homes that are in the urban wildland interface. And sure, this is a Western North Carolina problem, but it's also an Eastern North Carolina problem. Those PD soils out in Eastern North Carolina can smolder and burn for a very long time. So one of the things my office is doing, we're putting a new monitoring station out at Nags Head, in part to help Jockey's Ridge understand prescribed burning, but also new data for all of you. So that will be coming online this summer. This is a global problem, but we need local solutions. Community-centered research is going to be the way we address these great resilience challenges. I know Seacoast is doing this. I know a number of people on the call are actively working with community partners as research partners. And this can be very strange to people in academia, but we really need the community members on board to build resilience in their own towns. And we're all well positioned to do this work. Look at the research enterprise in North Carolina, look at the talent, but also kind of the strong, robust community groups we have and people who really want to see change. One of the things that we all need to do a better job on is partnering with HBCUs on grant proposals. They are in their communities, they are community groups, they know them well. It's one of the things that I have made one of my priorities over the next few years. But also, how do we give back? How do we give back to these communities that we take from? We take research from them. We publish papers on it and our careers advance, but what can we give them in return? An adaptation plan isn't always enough. How do we pay people for their time? We run into problems with that in grants where we can't write in that sort of thing. So we need to fix that system. But can we offer communities something related to the universities? So some sort of training that they could take at UNC or NC State to help kind of then build their resilience. And I just wanted to make a quick note of a project that's spinning up. My office is a part of it. We're going to be mapping urban heat in Raleigh and Durham. And this is just the first iteration of the North Carolina cities that we'll be doing this in. Certainly, we would take this method and this work elsewhere around the state. But this is a great example of actionable science that can be policy relevant and useful for cities. So it's a collaboration between the Durham Science Museum and Raleigh Science Museum, my office, Durham County, City of Raleigh, and the National Weather Service, Activate Good, really just a bunch of groups and a ton of enthusiasm about getting out there and digging into this climate risk in their own backyards. So this is a model I would like to see us use more often for all the climate risks, because when you get the community members involved in science and reminding folks that you don't need a PhD to do science, everyone can do science, is really empowering. So if you want to volunteer, we're going to be doing this sometime between June and July. There are plenty of 90-degree days for us to pick from here. So we have that going for us, but we found that some areas of the city can be 10 to 15 degrees hotter than some of the outlying areas or the parks or suburban areas that have a lot of green. I will quickly wrap this up because I know I'm rambling on, but barriers to effective resilience, capacity, it's always a thing. We have a lot of people in small communities who are doing 15 different jobs as a city planner, and they might not have the access or ability to apply for funding. A lack of shared vision and values can be tough, especially between a researcher and a community. So going into the community with an open ear and kind of not a direct research plan is always advisable. Stakeholder fatigue, we see this in North Carolina. Some of these towns have been studied left and right and up and down. We have homogenous research teams, so we work with people we know. Of course, that's fun. We like to do that, but we could strive to mix things up probably a bit between early career and senior researchers and people from other institutions like HBCUs. There are outdated mechanisms for funding. This is not our problem, but some of these federal grants are so restrictive that it's tough to do anything but a research project. And relationships need to be developed over time, and grant cycles don't facilitate that. So how do we as a community continue those relationships when the grant funding isn't there, or when the project's over, or when we're in Raleigh and Durham or Chapel Hill? So I'll just skip to the end. This is a dramatically different North Carolina. So the State Climate Office is different than it was 10 years ago, and North Carolina is different than it was 10 years ago. And there are large future climate changes in store if our reliance on fossil fuels for energy continues. That's an increase of 4 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit in average temperatures by the end of the century. This is disruptive sea level rise and coastal flooding. This is increases in intensity and frequency of extreme rainfall, more intense hurricanes, higher absolute humidity levels. The way I like to put it is a hotter, wetter, more humid North Carolina. That's climate change. But we can fix it. And my call to action on Earth Day, this is a research challenge, but also a moral challenge. We owe the 10.5 million people of North Carolina the power of our research enterprise to address our wicked challenges. There are people hurting very deeply at every step, so centering empathy is important, but we can do this. I know we can. Like I said, I'm feeling very optimistic today, so I wanted to carry that message ahead to all of you. So I will end there and take any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kathy. I gave the prompt in the chat a little bit late for Q&A, and by a little bit late, it was a minute ago. So while we're waiting for some questions to come in, thanks again for your talk. I got a couple of messages privately, or some questions. Can you specifically discuss the Avon situation? What are they considering to make the town more resilient? What are your recommendations as the state climatologist for a solution for Avon?
So my recommendations don't necessarily matter. I don't live there. I think it's up to the residents to decide what to do. So what they were proposing was a 50% tax to nourish the beaches and I think build some infrastructure. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's, I think, one of the things that we've run into as climate scientists is we're not always the ones who should be prescribing the solution. I can help you think through it and I can help you access the science, but people have always kind of asked me, well, you know, what should this group do or what should so-and-so do? And I think we've realized it's deeply personal and deeply community-based.
Thanks for that, Kathy. I think that answers that question. Marty, you have a question? You want to go ahead?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Kathy, for your talk, and it really triggered a lot of thinking, but also resonated with my own personal experiences of living in North Carolina. So it's helpful to have those two things happening simultaneously. And I wanted to ask you a little more about this kind of 2x2 box that you put up that alluded to kind of mitigation of climate change via switching away from fossil fuels and adaptation to climate change as being this sort of really important aspect of resilience. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is the kind of who is the we in those two different framings. So, are they different in the sense that if we as North Carolina don't adapt, no matter what happens, we're going to be in trouble. But if we as North Carolina unilaterally switch off of fossil fuels, the effect on climate change is going to depend pretty much on what everybody else does. And so I'm just wondering sort of how to navigate that. And the reason that I'm particularly interested in this is that in my field in economics, people kind of work on one or the other. So there are people who work on adaptation, and there are people who work on climate mitigation policy. And often they don't really intersect, except to the extent that it comes into integrated assessment. So I'm just interested in your further thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, you nailed it. So I've always worked on adaptation, and whenever anybody comes to me about mitigation, I'm like, cut fossil fuels, I don't know. But some of the things we do for adaptation are maladaptive to mitigation and vice versa. So we definitely need to be talking more there. The diagram is definitely too simplistic. And when I worked in Oregon, I would testify in front of the legislature, and they would always nail me with, we are less than 1% of the world's global emissions. Why should we be cutting our fossil fuels if nobody else is going to do it? So we are fully dependent on what the planet does. We as North Carolinians could stop using fossil fuels today, and we're not going to bend that curve very much. But again, I think it gets back to some of the morality and leadership. So we all share the atmosphere, doesn't stop at the Virginia border and whatnot. And we saw yesterday that Governor Cooper sent a letter to the Biden administration asking to ban the sale of fossil fuel emitting cars, greenhouse gas emitting cars by 2035. So we can control our landscape, we can adapt. That's what we've got control over. But the mitigation, we can be leaders, but yeah, you're right, we're not going to change that on our own. It's a really interesting conundrum, kind of being at the push and pull of both of them. And I'd love to talk to you more at some point. I think there's probably a lot I could learn from you.
Kathy, we have a couple more that came privately in the chat. So historically, climate scientists have been focused on analyzing global and regional changes in temperature and weather patterns. However, this information does not translate to community level adaptation decisions. So you were talking about this shift towards community-based analysis. What do you think are the current hurdles to providing communities with information that they need to make adaptation decisions?
Yeah, great question. So if reports were going to save the world, we would have saved the world by now. We've written so many climate reports. I have personally written some of them. They're great sources of information, but we've learned that handing off a 250-page report of graphs isn't necessarily actionable. One of the things is capacity. I can't serve every community that comes to me, and that's tough. So we're seeing some hearings in Congress right now about a federal climate service. That would be great. But also getting back to the Urban Heat Project, getting people involved in the research. Sure, I can give you all the global climate model projections and whatnot, but the empirical observations that we make in our own community and our own lived experiences are so important. And we know the areas that flood in Raleigh. You don't need me to point to the ground and say that's flooding. And having community members design research projects with climate scientists is really important, because I can walk in and say, oh man, we got to be really worried about these overnight temperatures. It's going to be more days over 75. And somebody can turn to me and say, no, we can deal with that. We have X, Y, and Z for that. Our problem is when it's over 100 for 7 days in a row. So that's just a random example. But also sustainability. Like I said, the grant ends, we go away. How do we empower people to keep doing the research and the observations and the monitoring on their own so that it can be mainstreamed into grant proposals for resilience? We need a lot of things. It would be nice to have, you know, a full, I have 10 people in my office and we still don't have enough capacity, but, you know, just having more people in communities using NC State Extension, they're a great resource. Figuring out how we can leverage and just leverage some of the work that we're doing across the state.
So I have a follow-up question. I've heard from some communities that they want to engage with researchers to increase the visibility of the problems that are going on in their community. So they're not being heard, they feel, at a state level. And as a researcher, I'm wondering what vehicles can I use other than just publications to really amplify their needs? Would it be working with the state climatology office? Are there other like vehicles that the state of North Carolina is putting in place that we can connect these small or community scale problems to state solutions?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yes, my office to some extent, some of the state agencies, especially NCORE, the North Carolina Office of Resiliency and Recovery, and Dr. Amanda Martin is the new Chief Resilience Officer. She's the UNC grad. And I would also just say, you know, there's work we could be doing with our elected officials as well. And I know there are hoops that we need to jump through for that, but I've taken a number of just informational meetings with our Congress people and some of our state representatives. It's not to lobby for anything. It's not asking for specific policy, but it's, I'm here as a resource. And these are some of the things I'm hearing in communities. So we can certainly do that. And I think it's great for grad students to do that sort of thing too.
I think we had one more question come through. Let me scroll back up. Oh, it was Brad. Brad, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, you made the statement that low-income and minority communities are most at risk from climate change effects. And I just wondered if you could elaborate on that. I can think of an example or two, but I'm curious what you've got in mind.
Yeah, so climate change isn't really a middle class or upper class problem right now. And I left this out because I'm feeling good today, but during the Malibu wildfires a few years ago, the Kardashians hired their own firefighters. And people with means and money can get out of harm's way, whether it's permanently or on an episodic basis. And what we're learning, there was a great series in the News and Observer a few months ago on rural heat and farm workers. You know, these people are living in conditions that are barely humane, and they don't have access to air conditioning. Or we're hearing from folks in Southeast Raleigh that they have air conditioners, but they can't afford to turn them on. And we're seeing heat-related, I'm going back to heat because this is what I've been working on recently, but heat-related morbidity and mortality in places where it's preventable. A lot of our heat deaths are always preventable. And some of it's a lack of education, some of it's a lack of adaptation or specific measures that communities can take to direct people to resources. But I think the scariest thing for me as a climate scientist personally is starting to see fatalities from climate-related events that are super grim. The Camp Fire in California, the flooding we saw in Johnston County this year in North Carolina. And it's often happening to the people who have the least ability to do something about it.
Thank you.
Amanda, you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you, Kathy. That was a great talk. I'm wondering, you mentioned something that I've heard a lot, and that's that coastal managers and everyone who's working on these issues, there's a lack of capacity. We need, more time, more funding, more people. And one of the ways of getting around that or fixing that problem is being able to connect people with all the information they need and all the ones that you've had so that broader areas can learn from each other. And I was just wondering if you had any more thoughts on ways to do that, ways of increasing that capacity through everyone being on the same page.
Yeah, that's a great question. There will never be enough money or capacity. So if that's going to be our sticking point, we have to figure out how to get past this. And sometimes online tools are helpful, but do we need another tool? Is it tough to use? Is it actually helpful? I think one of the things that has become very interesting to me is the use of some of these community spaces like museums, libraries, churches as conduits for information. So we see in research, people trust climate scientists still, which is a surprise someday with when I see my inbox, but people really trust each other. So talking to people about climate change is one of the best things you can do. So empowering people to talk to their circles of influence, I think, is one way to get the information out. And I also just think that it's just been under-resourced for the past long time. It's not just the past 4 years. NOAA has a program called the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments that's specifically meant to work with climate resilience in communities. And it's an $11 million program for the entire country. So not very much money. The amount of money we spend on other things is more significant. So I think we also, again, this is my personal opinion, working with our elected officials to understand the importance of this kind of work in communities, I think is really important, but also groups like Sea Grant and Extension, we need to be utilizing their full capacity, and they are strapped as well, but they are trusted community members and in all these counties, and my office relies on them. We don't always need to necessarily show up in New Hanover County if there's already a trusted individual there. So working on leveraging some of that capacity as well in translation.
Thanks.
Okay, I think with that, Kathy, thank you so much. That was a great discussion, great presentation. I'm going to hand it off to Marty, who's going to frame our discussion, our wrap-up discussion.
Okay, thank you again, Kathy, for really stimulating a lot of discussion, and we seeded some specific questions in ahead of time relating to flood risks, as well as kind of thinking about communities and infrastructure. But I want to start with something a little bigger picture, which I think any discussion of mitigation versus adaptation and some of the tensions there really brings up, and that's are there ways to get us out of this or unstuck from this pattern of dealing with the immediacy of climate impacts, and actually plan for a future that deals more effectively in the long term? And Kathy mentioned, she used this word maladaptive, and that's a word that comes up, I think, a lot in this discussion. Are some of the things that seem to be sensible things to do in the near term fundamentally maladaptive in the long term? So I want to start with this open-ended question like that and think about what do different disciplines that we've heard from have to say about this question. And maybe that's too hard of a question to start with, but I want to toss it out there because I think it relates to a lot of the grand challenges that are underlying the venture that we're embarking on Seacoast.
Marty, can you give an example? Like from as an economist?
Well, yeah. So certainly the one that the example that we've talked about most prominently in our kind of what I would think of as sort of the core team that began a lot of this research, or some subset of which has been working together for many years, is this idea that, well, we're kind of in this pattern of nourishing beaches, and then overwash comes in and gets dumped on roads, and then of course we need to clear that sand out, and we need to push it back out to the beach or get it off the roads. But then that in turn limits the abilities for, say, barrier islands to through this their natural processes to continue to elevate in response to sea level rise. And so that's a situation where the immediacy of the impact from storms, some of which would happen anyway and aren't necessarily climate related, but some of the intensification of which we think of as climate related, and certainly the sea level rise is related to climate. So this immediate short-term solution that makes total economic sense for a lot of communities is something that could exacerbate long-term harms and doesn't seem to be adaptive in the long run. And so this is kind of a starting point for a lot of our discussion. What do different views in different scientific disciplines have to say about how to get us out of this type of paradigm?
And I'll just throw in on top of that, Marty, that's a really excellent starting point. The makes sense part that you said, and then you followed up and said it very explicitly, makes economic sense. I'll just point out that that's a big part of the maladaptive piece. To the extent that these short-term decisions are decisions based on sort of resource extraction in some way, monetization of what the natural environment is, that makes sense. I think could be defined differently in different disciplines. And it might not at all involve anything like nourishment or altering property values. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts on other ways that short-term making sense could happen.
And I think just to follow up on that, those of us who've been thinking about this question have thought less about it in the context of flooding. And so I know we have some of the flooding experts on the call here, and this is an area where I wonder if are there similar patterns? Are there things that we do in the short to medium run to address flooding that might be very maladaptive in the long term? And how do we kind of think about the problem differently?
Tony.
I see Antonio is unmuting, so I really hope you have something to say.
Yeah, if you're looking for a flood example, we did some research in the Houston-Galveston region that showed that channelization can be maladaptive over the long term because you're forcing the channel into a state over long time periods where it can no longer respond to flood events. And so not only is it maladaptive in the sense that you push flooding into other areas, but also we've seen that over the long term, that system becomes more prone to flooding as it continues to develop, because both the perception of the people developing in that area means that they develop closer to the stream because they think that it's safe, but also the stream itself can't respond to those flood pulses and adapt physically. So that's just one example from the flood world where we have shown that something is maladaptive over the long term, even though it makes economic sense and reduces flooding tomorrow.
Great. I see Phil Burke has a hand up. fully expected to hear from you on this.
Yeah, I'm sorry I joined late. I was on an all-day conference call this morning with the Coastal Resilience Center, but I really wanted to chime in on, that's a great question you posed to us. And that's something I've been thinking about a long time, maladaptive approaches, particularly in the flooding world. And I can recall, and then Tony is very familiar with this argument. So is Catherine, probably, being Texans were recently transplanted. One of the things that bothered me always about putting big dikes up, like the Texas asking the federal government for 17 billion to put a dike up, at least that was the last cost. And you know, when we want kind of these structural solutions oftentimes, because we don't have to change our behavior. We could put up a seawall, or we could make a building code stronger, but we still may be building in a dangerous location where the sea is steadily rising, the hurricanes are getting more intense, the inland flooding, and eventually we're going to have to make some real human behavioral changes. And this, where we build, I think Houston, for example, wants, deregulated development. They don't tell us what to do with our land. This is Texas. And so it sprawls all over the place, including in the floodplains. And they put roads right in the middle of the floodplains, and it stimulates development. And then they want heavy structural investments that are kind of engineering driven. And particularly, when it's getting more and more expensive. The Dutch realize this, I think, the last few years. They're putting more emphasis on land use. They say that so much of their GNP keeps getting invested into building, sea walls and levees and dikes and so on. And now the sea level rise is happening and the glaciers are melting quickly in Switzerland and the precipitation events are getting more intense. So they have a whole program called Room for the River. I think there are 30 projects now. And they're actually letting the rivers going to run where they go and moving parts of cities. And it's just getting too expensive so that's I teach a lot in land use planning, so I have a bias too, but I think it's a pretty objective.
I think it's quite provocative to think that the Dutch have reached the limits of their engineering solutions. Brad had a hand up, and then Megan.
Well, Phil's comments bring to mind a potentially different tweak on the framing of short-term needs versus long-term needs that you brought up, Marty. And the barrier example in mind, it seems pretty clear that if you ask what communities need, and Kathy was talking about it in this sense, that to respond to community needs is a trend in science, and kind of being a devil's advocate, if we were to just be focused on what communities need, it's going to tend to be focused on short-term needs, like we need a really big dune to protect from the next storm, which makes total sense on the time scale of storms. And the needs of future generations, or the next generation, if that's going to be a habitat for that community into the future, the needs of the future versions of that community might be different. And the flooding example is great, Phil. If we ask those parts of those towns or neighborhoods that are being moved out of the floodplain in the Netherlands to let the floodplain mitigate flooding elsewhere, what they need, they probably say we need bigger walls along the current channel. So there are tensions between what communities need on what timescales that are part of the tough system to fully understand. That so much of the decision making and the evolution gets driven by the short-term needs. What does that end up leading to in the long term?
Megan, I think you're up.
Mine might be a step removed from your question, and potentially more of a tension, as Brad just described. But I think that our efforts right now are oriented toward recognizing the wide array of impacts and the wide array of processes and the diversity across communities in the challenges they face. And our response to that is to really focus on community agency and community-oriented decision-making and community autonomy in managing resources and managing decision-making about their futures. But the history of the United States is such that when we decentralize decision-making, we have tended to give more opportunity for wealthy, high resource, highly educated, white political actors to manipulate outcomes. And so a lot of the sort of prescriptions that I see in planning literature and in a lot of the sciences literature are for things like, wetlands and green infrastructure and, local regulatory processes like water supply requirements and land, zoning and land use requirements. And those have always been used for the benefit of wealthy white property owners. And so our efforts to sort of decentralize and give community agency, I think we often picture that helping historically marginalized communities, but it hasn't been. That hasn't been what's happened before. That's not what's happening right now in community level decision making. And so that's potentially maladaptive.
Yeah, boy, you hit it right on the head. I mean, this is what's driving so much of what we're doing now in the planning field, and the structural racism, and it's really hitting home the last 4 or 5 years. And empowering communities, but in a way where we have to hold accountable some type of equity lens that's being used to track who is being, if we're asking people to make behavioral changes and we're making investments and regulations, what's the distribution of the effects on different types of people, and then trying to hold accountable. And there's some good examples, like Baltimore has they're applying an equity lens to all their planning now. And it goes right down to, well, you might start collecting some data you think you need, but if you apply an equity lens, it opens up in terms of research, another whole perspective on how you might collect the data. I don't know, I'm talking too much in the abstract, but I don't want to dominate, but yeah.
So
But I really agree with your points, Megan.
I want to raise, I see there's another hand raised. Catherine, you have a comment on this, and I have another follow-up question maybe to push the discussion a little bit differently. But why don't you go ahead, Catherine?
I have a question for Megan and Phil. So as physical scientists, are there ways that, or vehicles that we can use to track where we do science as well, in terms of increasing our equity in terms of visibility of adaptation studies? Could that be used as a way to, without a policy change, like create a system where we are more equitable in terms of where we concentrate our scientific endeavors?
Megan, I can take a shot, but I need to.
Phil, you go first. You have more experience with this.
Oh, thank you.
I got one thought to follow up after you.
Those are the real $1 million questions. And I think of like the civil rights movement, And if it wasn't for the Supreme Court, when Megan was talking, you know, nothing would have, we had some major we had some terrible ones in the 19th century, Plessy versus Ferguson, Dred Scott, those things. But we also had in the 60s, 1960s, some major, we couldn't move without the federal government forward on the civil rights. So I think in our own work, what gets, responding to Catherine, I think we found oftentimes, like I'm observing what happened in Baltimore recently in terms of stormwater infrastructure. They're using an equity lens for capital improvements programs, for land use plans and these kinds of things. And what basically they found that they couldn't really measure the distributional impacts of making investments. I'm just concentrating on stormwater infrastructure because they weren't collecting the data that they needed. They thought they were collecting plenty of data in reducing the stormwater impacts on the neighborhoods, but they weren't collecting in a way that they could be geopositioned properly, could be measured in a way that has a distributional aspects to it. So it's caused them to collect data differently. And it's caused them to develop tools to be able to analyze the information and then to look at how well they're distributing their investments. And so just that one example, I think you engage the community right off, and you have to kind of co-produce knowledge and co-produce information. And good information comes from science and informing the neighborhood, the people you're engaging. And it takes a whole set of skills to engage, particularly where there's deep mistrust. There's a long history of racism. You know, there are cities on the North Carolina coast that, you know, we've had some that have these deeply embedded structural racism problems. And they have to be included in the conversation from the get-go, the procedural equity, and then adapt the science that we do to help answer questions and to frame it in a way that they can understand and use and act on. And there's some examples of that, but good examples, but it's far and few between. I don't know, maybe I'm talking too abstractly. It's hard to say it cleanly. And I'm not a person of color, and I don't know, you know, but anyway, we try to do that in our work.
I think about this, Catherine, in sort of two different ways. One is the sort of the composition of the community that's affected by the research, however we might think about that, or is engaged in the research. But I also think, because I'm thinking government terms, I think a lot about the size of the local government, right? And what Baltimore is able to do is really different from what a town of, you know, 15,000 people is able to do. And I think that our research tends to either work with the Baltimores or with the Nags Heads. And we don't often think about the towns of, you know, 5 to 20,000 that don't have the resources of a Nags Head, don't have these staffs, don't have these, you know, the capacity to start internally thinking about using GIS, right, to figure out stormwater impacts. And so that puts more work on the researchers to start thinking about working with those low resource small communities, because they don't have any resources, right? They don't have any capacity, and potentially don't even have time or interest in working with us because it's just a challenge. But I think about it sort of along the two dimensions, right? Like, what's the distribution of the composition of the community, but also sort of what's possible then depends on kind of the government size and its capacity.
So I want to raise the question about whether we are inadvertently drawing sort of false dichotomies in the way we talk about this within our disciplines. And I'm not saying we are, but I think there is this sort of, we're talking about a tension between devolving decision-making to the local and sort of a more centrally planned set of decisions. we talk about sort of the tension between kind of short run oriented decisions and sort of long run outcomes. We also talk about sort of tensions between economic development and really the necessity of some attention to that, and other kind of community outcomes that matter. And it strikes me that different disciplines have different levels of emphasis on these aspects of the, these dichotomies. And so I'm wondering if people would like to, talk about this in more general terms, like what can we do to have a richer interdisciplinary conversation about what otherwise seem to be rather, stark extremes. This is, this may not be the best question I've posed, but I feel like this is part of our mandate as a collaboratory, is to figure out how do we really leverage what we can learn from each other to break through these kind of sharp distinctions. I want to encourage everyone to either, raise hands or, say something in the chat if you'd like to weigh in on this. Maybe even just start descriptively. Where does your discipline situate these problems?
Yeah, I can speak towards this a little bit. I'm new to this group, and I'm a PhD student, but I'm a social scientist, and I've been working at USGS on coastal issues. And I've been really lucky to be a part of several very interdisciplinary teams, both at USGS and at NOAA. And I think one of the keys to interdisciplinarity being successful is having a team where everyone has a lot of respect for each other and each other's disciplines. So I found that in situations where my coworkers are like, I don't know anything about social science, and you're the person who knows about this, so I'm going to defer to you, and I'm going to listen to what you have to say on this, and vice versa. And that's been really successful, I think.
Thank you. That your experience very much resonates with mine as well. This I think it's important to be really critical and curious about the other people's expertise, but at the same time have a level of deference, and because people do have very different expertise. Brad, you have some thoughts on this?
Oh, just wanted to give my disciplinary perspective-ish. As a geomorphologist, my lens tends to be long-term. I'm looking at how these landforms come to be and how they evolve over time, and the time scales involved are, at least multiple storms for those kinds of questions. And so that's my main disciplinary lens on the time scale. But then for a developed coastline, I really can't address these systems without understanding the human decision-making, which is, human decision-making is a integral part of the coastal system that you can't avoid even if you wanted to. So for me, I guess what I'd like to know from other social sciences is is it possible that people will make that decisions will evolve in the future as we understand this system more? So if we're trying to understand how this system works over long time scales, how people work is a big part of it. Clearly, how people are working presently and in the near past has been thinking about short time scale adaptation and mitigation and recovery. And I could, having learned from you, Marty, think as an economist that, well, we just have this discount great, where the future matters to us less. And I suspect there are other social science lenses that might come to bear on, is it possible that if people understood more about how the coupled system works, that they'd maybe make different choices if they knew about the future consequences of the shorter term decisions? And if it's just a discount phenomena, then no. So that's a large level of ignorance about how the human component of this system works that I'd love to know more about.
So it occurred to me that when we talk about planning for the future, we probably are not all talking about the same thing, because as Brad just pointed out, he thinks about very long time scales in how these landforms unfold. So just as an exercise, if people will indulge this, what would be put in the chat, what is your main kind of discipline? I'm an economist, a political scientist, a geomorphologist, and a planner, whatever your main disciplinary affiliation is, and then just say how many years you think is kind of the central time period to plan. Like what should we be planning for? And I'm actually, I know this sounds a little bit of a contrivance, but I'm really curious to see what people will say. And so if people could just chat that one thing, discipline and how many years, to everyone in the chat. No judgment, just a curiosity about what people think. And while people do that, I'm going to call on Miyuki, who's got her hand up.
Hi. Oh, I just realized I didn't have my video on. Apologies. This has been super interesting conversation. I think I was thinking actually along the same lines as you, Marty, with kind of differences in not only the time scale, but I think one of the interesting things to me around different disciplines is like the geographic scale and how we think about sort of a unit of analysis and what's optimal. And so I think there's a very big, I feel like in some social science disciplines, there's a big emphasis on societally optimal and generalizable aggregate average effects. Like that is what the discipline is oriented around measuring. And in other disciplines, for instance, in planning, there's lots of focus at the local government unit. Sometimes smaller than that, neighborhood scales. And sometimes things are considered optimal at neighborhood scale with no consideration for what's happening around it, right? Which I think is very contradictory to how other people think about societally optimal things. But I feel like that ends up being the benefit of the interdisciplinary context, right? Is that like some people are only going to be satisfied if you get some population-wide average effect, and some people are going to think that's a terrible thing to be working towards. And therefore what we need to be working towards is like the effect on this person at this time at this place. And they'll have different ways of doing that. But to some extent, like the disagreement is where like the richness comes in, right? Is that like we do, I think, different end outcomes are prioritized in research.
That's a really helpful perspective, and still people are chatting in. People can monitor the different responses in the chat. There was one message directly to me from Don Kirkman. Don, I'm not sure if you're able to unmute if you want to pose this question. I think you've raised a really great question that's it's slightly different from the ones we've been asking, but it really is getting at the question of what are the different roles of different levels of government, and are the expectations of those different levels of government clearly articulated with respect to resilience. So if we think about the US context of sort of federal, state, and local, and with recognizing that there are some other levels that are more complicated than that, but just thinking about that, are the roles for resilience articulated clearly, or is that still an incomplete project?
Marty, this is Don. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Don. Please.
Yeah. And I'm an economic development professional, and I've spent my career working with local governments at different levels. And what I have seen over the last several decades as climate change and its related impacts have become more prominent is a reticence to accept responsibility and more of, someone else needs to provide the solution. So if often the impacts are very localized. I mean, Avon, is dealing with an existential challenge. Whose responsibility is it to address that? Obviously, Avon is talking about increasing their tax rate by 50%. But as we think about these challenges, I don't think we have clearly established where those responsibilities should lie. And as a consequence, solutions become, lobbying for an earmark to fix, a federal earmark or a state appropriation to fix a local problem. And at some point, I think these problems, just as the Netherlands are now recognizing the immensity of some of these problems, that we have to be honest about this. So if you incorporate a new municipality, there are certain expectations about services that you provide. Well, does that include dealing with climate resilience? And so I think it's hard when you're talking about these solutions to not have that framework established about who's, should a taxpayer in Kansas re-nourish the Carteret County beaches? I mean, through an allocation of their tax dollars through the federal government to fund, a problem that really they're not responsible for, or arguably not responsible for. Anyway, so my point on your other question was just in terms of planning horizons, because the decision makers also are generally the elected leaders. I mean, at the end of the day, their horizons tend to be election cycles, and their funding commitments tend to be very short term. What are we going to put in this year's budget? And even at the state level, when you have a long session, you basically have a 2-year funding planning horizon. So, those are challenges in addressing the longer term issues, because the local leader focus is much more short term.
Thanks, John. That really a lot of great insights there. And I think we have had a discussion that is very much a beginnings of synthesis from what we've heard in Disciplines 101. And by no means have we managed to touch on everything that we've learned throughout this academic year. But we are out of time for today. So I just want to thank everyone for participating in this somewhat challenging, open-ended kind of environment here, but really thinking hard about how do we put some of the best science from different disciplines together to address some of the grand challenges that coastal communities face. And we will continue the discussion as we move forward toward next fall. So thank you everyone for participating, and thanks again to Kathy for a great presentation to start today off.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.